This video will explain how to use and review the climate change allowances. This short video is relevant to you if you're a local authority planner checking if a flood risk assessment has adequately considered climate change, or if you're undertaking a flood risk assessment and want to check which climate change allowances apply. This video will explain how to find the right climate change allowances for your situation. The NPPF sets out those circumstances when development proposals will need to be supported by a flood risk assessment. It is usually required if development could be at risk from any source of flooding, now or at any time during its expected lifetime. Flood risk assessments need to show if development will be safe throughout its lifetime without increasing flood risk elsewhere. The assessment should inform the location, layout and design of the development, including things like village floor levels, compensatory floodplain storage and drainage design. To find the right allowances, you're going to need to access some key information. We've included some links in the accompanying text to help you do this. First up, you're going to need to access the Environment Agency's .gov.uk guidance titled Flood Risk Assessment Climate Change Allowances. You'll then need to find the proposed development site, and to do this you'll need to use a postcode, the name of the nearest river, the name of the river management catchment. Alternatively, you'll be able to manually zoom into the right location on a map. You'll need to know the development's vulnerability classification by checking the proposed development against Annex 3 of the NPPF. Where development falls into more than one vulnerability classification, you should use the highest of the categories. You'll need to estimate the development's expected lifetime by referring to planning guidance. Residential development should use a minimum of 100 years. But for non-residential development, depending on the characteristics of the proposed development, 75 years is likely to be an appropriate starting point. And finally, you'll need to know which sources of flood risk could affect the site. You can do this by checking the flood risk assessment or by referring to the relevant local planning authority's strategic flood risk assessment. Now we're going to show you how to use the climate change allowances guidance on .gov.uk. The guidance is split into three main sections, with separate allowances given for peak river flow, which are for using when development could be at risk of flooding from a watercourse, peak rainfall intensity, which is used to inform both drainage design and where development could be at risk from surface water flooding, and finally sea level rise, which is for use where development could be at risk of flooding from the sea, estuaries or tidal rivers. We'll run through each of these in turn. If your site is affected by more than one source of flooding, you may need to review each source in turn. River flooding. If the site is or could be at risk of river flooding, also known as fluvial flooding, you'll need to use the peak river flow allowances section of the guidance. To find the right allowance, click on the link to the peak river flow map, and this will take you to a separate interactive map. Next, you'll need to find the site on a map. You can do this in one of two ways. Firstly, by using the search box, you can type in the site's postcode, the name of the nearest river, such as Thames or Severn, or if you do know it, the name of the relevant river management catchment. Alternatively, you can just navigate to the right location on the map. You can drag the map by holding down the left button of your mouse. You can zoom in and out using the scroll wheel on your mouse, and once you've found the right location, left-click once on the correct river management catchment. Following these steps will bring up a table with the peak river flow allowances for the site. The table shows allowances for 3 epochs or time frames and for 3 different climate change scenarios. The correct allowances are determined by the existing flood zone. That's flood zone 1, 2, 3A or 3B. The vulnerability classification of the proposed development, the expected lifetime of the proposed development, and the vulnerability classification of existing development that could be affected by the proposed development. In the vast majority of cases, you'll need to use the 2080s column and the central allowance. In some rare cases, a different allowance may apply. You may need to use an earlier epoch if the expected lifetime of the development is much shorter than 75 years. You may need to use the higher central allowance if the proposal includes development classified as essential infrastructure, or if the proposed development could increase flood risk to existing development, also classified as essential infrastructure, or if the proposal lies within flood zone 3B, known as the functional floodplain, where this is shown in the relevant strategic flood risk assessment. Lastly, you'll need to take a slightly different approach to assessing river flooding from rivers with catchments smaller than 5 square kilometres, and in these cases, it's more appropriate to use the peak rainfall intensity uplifts instead. The next section of the video will cover allowances for peak rainfall intensity. You'll need to refer to the peak rainfall intensity allowance section of the guidance to inform drainage design, also to assess if the site could be at risk of surface water flooding, and as mentioned on the previous slide, to assess river flooding in catchments smaller than 5 square kilometres. To find the right allowance, click on the link to the peak rainfall allowances map. This will take you to a different interactive map than that used for river flooding. Again, you'll need to find the site on the map, and you can do this in the same way as you did for river flooding, using either the search box with simple location information or by navigating using your mouse. Again, if you're navigating by the mouse, left click once on the correct management catchment. Following these steps will bring up two tables with the peak rainfall intensity allowances for two different rainfall events. The tables show allowances for two epochs or time frames and for two different climate change scenarios. The correct allowances are determined by the expected lifetime of the proposed development. So for developments with an expected lifetime beyond 2100, you should use the upper end allowances for the 2070s epoch. You'll need to use this for all residential purposes due to the lifetime of development. For developments with an expected lifetime between 2061 and 2100, use the central allowance for the 2070s epoch. Use this for most commercial uses, unless the lifetime extends beyond 2100. And for developments with an expected lifetime up to 2060, use the central allowance for the 2050s epoch. This is only likely to be used for development with short lifetimes, and these may require additional planning controls. In each case, the assessment will need to consider the impact on both the 1% and the 3.3% annual exceedance probability events. In a small number of locations, the allowances for the 2050s epoch is higher than the 2070s epoch, and in those locations where the development has a lifetime beyond 2061, you should use the higher of those two allowances. Next, we're going to consider the allowances for sea level rise. You'll need to refer to the sea level allowances section of the guidance if the proposed development site could be at risk of flooding from the sea, from an estuary, or a tidal river. Sea level rise allowances are provided as far as 2125 for two different climate scenarios, higher central and upper end. Flood risk assessments will need to consider both scenarios. Separate allowances are provided for each river basin district. If you don't know which river basin district the site lies in, follow the link to the river basin district map. Once you've found the correct river basin, use Table 1 on the .gov.uk webpage to calculate the sea level rise that applies to the proposed development site. If the proposed development has an expected lifetime of 100 years, you can use the final column of Table 1, as it shows the cumulative sea level rise expected over this period. For any other period, you'll need to do a quick calculation to work out the sea level rise. You may also need to ensure that allowances cater for offshore wind speed, larger waves, and the effects of surge, depending on the source of information used. Here is an example for a development in the Anglian River Basin district with an expected lifetime of 75 years, for example, office or other commercial development, taking the development lifetime to the year 2100. You can also see that this is 5 years into the final epoch, which runs from 2096 to 2125. The table on .gov.uk shows the sea level rise in millimetres per year for each epoch and scenario. Also note that in brackets there is a cumulative sea level rise provided for each epoch, which can make the calculation simpler. In this case, to find the higher central allowance, you need to add together the cumulative rise for the first 3 epochs. These numbers are shown in brackets on the screen under the higher central column, giving you the values of 203, 261 and 348 millimetres. This gives you a running total of 812 millimetres. Finally, you'll need to calculate the allowance for 5 years into the final epoch to take you to 2100. To do this, multiply the annual allowance of 13 millimetres by 5 to give you 65 millimetres. Add this to the running total figure from the first 3 epochs to give you 877 millimetres over the expected lifetime of the development. The same calculation can also be done for the upper end allowance, and in this example this gives you a cumulative total of 1148.5 millimetres. Offshore wind speed and extreme wave height also needs to be assessed. Flood risk assessments may need to account for the impacts of climate change on these variables. In most cases, the Environment Agency coastal models may already include an appropriate wind speed and wave height allowance, but if other modelling is being used, you can find the appropriate allowance by referring to Table 2 on the .gov.uk webpage. The correct allowance is determined by the expected lifetime of development, but most development will fall under the second column, which is 2056 to 2125. You will only need to use the sensitivity test allowances in rare circumstances where the credible maximum scenario applies. More on this on a later slide. In the Anglian case, the allowance for both offshore wind speed and extreme wave height is 10%. This only needs to be applied once and not per epoch. Consideration also needs to be given to storm surge. So similar to wind speed and wave height, most Environment Agency coastal models already include an appropriate allowance for storm surge, but this needs to be checked. If other modelling is being used, you'll need to follow the link to the coastal flood boundary extreme levels. As we expect such instances to be more complex, we would suggest local planning authorities contact the Environment Agency to seek advice to ensure that any models take proper account of storm surge. The final section of this video deals with those rare cases where the credible maximum climate change scenarios may need to be considered. Before we move on to the climate change scenarios requiring the credible maximum to be considered, here is a quick summary checklist for assessing coastal tidal flood risk in flood risk assessments. You should check assumptions about development lifetime. You should ensure the correct river basin district has been identified and the correct allowances have been used by calculating the sea level rise for both the higher central and upper end for the lifetime of development. You should check in the flood risk assessment about assumptions used to ensure offshore wind, wave height and storm surge have been accounted for. And then onward from this, that the flood risk assessment has identified and used the correct allowances in considering layout, design, mitigation. There are situations where other allowances may need to be utilised. Credible maximum scenarios are low likelihood, high impact climate change scenarios which only usually need to be considered for developments such as nationally significant infrastructure projects, new settlements, and significant urban extensions. In these cases, as included in the guidance, you should refer to the H++ allowance of 1.9 metres of sea level rise by 2100. You should use the upper end allowance for peak river flow, sensitivity test allowances for offshore wind speed and extreme wave heights taken from Table 2 of the guidance, and an additional 2 millimetres per year on top of sea level rise allowances from 2017 for storm surge. For nationally significant infrastructure projects, you should refer to the relevant national policy statement for guidance on how to consider credible maximum climate change scenarios. And for other relevant development, you should treat this as a sensitivity test to help you ensure the development could be adapted to such scenarios over its lifetime. So we hope this video has helped you ensure the correct allowances are being used in flood risk assessments. Flood risk assessments are unlikely to be considered acceptable if they either fail to account for climate change or they account for climate change using the incorrect allowances. It's essential that flood risk assessments contain the right information on climate change. Such information is key to avoiding inappropriate development and to enable safe and climate resilient development.